Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. My guest this week is Bryant Mason. I've had Bryant on the podcast a few times in the past, and he's one of my favorite guests. Bryant is a certified crop advisor who specializes in organic cannabis nutrition. He has spent the last 5 years working to combine precision laboratory techniques with data science in an effort to unravel the complexities of cannabis soil and crop nutrition. Along with his work on soilless media, he also helps outdoor cultivators around the United States with nutrient management and cover cropping. If you would like to do soil testing, help with interpreting a soil test, or are interested in an online course on these subjects, his website is www.soildoctorconsulting.com. And if you want to save $100 on his course, you can use the discount code KIS Organics, all one word. And I've taken his course and was recently going back to review some of the content. It's excellent, and I highly recommend it for anyone wanting to do a deep dive on cannabis fertility and reusing your soil. Now on to the show. Hey, Bryant, welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having me, Tad.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you back on. You're one of our most popular guests. I always learn so much when I talk to you, so I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Do you want to, I know you've been on before, and I hope listeners go back and check out our previous podcasts, but if not, can you just give a quick background about yourself here, and then we'll dive right in?
Sure. My name is Bryant Mason, and I am a certified crop advisor. I work with many different growers across various crop types, primarily cannabis, but also tree fruit, diversified vegetables, any high value crop, more and more cut flowers. And I've had my own business for 5 or 6 years. And before that, I was doing a lot of consulting under other people's businesses, and I've been a grower. I also have my own farm. It's an 11-acre farm in Western Colorado. I have dozens of different crops, vegetables, and diversified fruit, but my primary cash crop is peaches, and I do a lot of experimentation in my orchard. So I specialize in nutrient management, and more specifically, I just do organic nutrient management. So I am constantly working with growers and exploring and learning about nutrition. So I'm sure we'll talk about some of that today, and we can just go from there.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I know that one of the first things that you want to talk about were some of these specific minerals. So let's just dive right in with that and kind of just share what's been on your brain lately.
Yeah, sure. So I would say in 2023, there were 3 nutrients that I kept thinking about and coming back to in various situations I was working with growers, and actually in my own peach orchard. The first is calcium. I think calcium has always been a very interesting nutrient for me. I've always been drawn to calcium. One of my general beliefs is that calcium has been fairly deprioritized in agriculture for the value that it provides to plant health and yield. And so I'm always thinking about calcium. And there's one thing, there's essentially 3 things that I think the cannabis community has generally accepted around calcium. It's the use of lime and gypsum in relatively high quantities to push calcium up in soil. The use of calcium foliars, and we can talk about that. And then the final thing is just proper irrigation and watering technique to really make sure that the transpiration stream is moving calcium into the parts of the plant that it's needed. But I've had multiple conversations with apple growers, and I think there's one thing that's missing in the cannabis community conversation around calcium that I wanted to share. And just to take a step back, the reason apple growers know more about calcium than any other group of growers, in my opinion, is because apple growers suffer from a disorder called bitter pit. So I don't know if you know this, but in your home state, specifically Eastern Washington, 90% of the organic apples are grown in Eastern Washington. And a lot of those apples are Honeycrisp because people love Honeycrisp. A little too sweet for my liking, but it's a good crunchy apple. And it is very susceptible to bitter pit, which is actually a calcium disorder. And these growers make a lot of money on selling Honeycrisp apples, but sometimes they can only sell half of the apples that they harvest because in storage they get this bitter pit, this calcium disorder. So they have figured out how to go from, let's say, 50% pack out to 95% pack out. And I've spoken to these growers at length about how they do that. And number one, a pretty basic yearly application of 1 ton per acre of gypsum banded in the rows of the trees. So again, I think cannabis growers are already applying gypsum. I recommend it in, I would say, moderate doses in the majority of my recommendations. I'm not alone. I think, you use gypsum. Everyone seems to use gypsum. Gypsum can be applied at way higher quantities, and the reason for this is because the solubility of gypsum is relatively low, and so anything it has a low salt index. So all fertilizers have a salt index, and gypsum's is relatively low because the solubility is relatively low. So if you apply excess gypsum, let's say 4 tons per acre, or in the case of peat-based media, like 25 pounds per yard, or even growers do more sometimes. It just sits as calcium sulfate. It doesn't dissolve any further into the solution, so it doesn't create too much salt stress. Obviously, gypsum will increase the EC of the soil, but not excessively where it'll burn the plant or create excessive osmotic stress. Okay, so gypsum is number one. The second thing that they do is they are constantly thinking about soil moisture and weighing consistent soil moisture versus drybacks, because like cannabis production, there are reasons to dry back fruit trees at critical times to do different things for fruit development. And so they're constantly aware that when they dry back their soil, they're going to reduce calcium uptake. So they would never dry back their soil at a critical point when they want calcium uptake during cell division. So I think we sort of understand that. The third thing is foliars, and this is where it gets a little more interesting. According to the guys I've talked to who have essentially eliminated bitter pit in apples, they don't think a few foliars do anything, but they are dead set on foliar spraying to get that extra 10% of calcium into the plant, and they do foliars every 48 hours during cell division. So they don't think just doing a couple foliars is going to influence calcium very much. And so instead, they double or triple down on calcium foliars. And during the cell division period of apple development, they're often applying a foliar every 48 hours, which is pretty intense from a management standpoint.
Yeah, I would think I immediately think of issues with labor, humidity, product
Yep.
costs. I mean, there's a ton of
Okay,
things
so
that pop up.
yeah, let's talk about that. So let's group labor and product costs into the same category because they're both dollars.
Yeah.
And when you grow a high value crop, the difference between 50% pack out and 100% pack out in Honeycrisp apples is like on 1,000 acres is millions of dollars. So they pay
Yeah.
for it. He believes this is the guy Steve and I spoke to believe he still thinks that, let's just say 90% of the calcium is taken up by the soil, but just that extra 10% in foliar is giving him that decrease in bitter pit enough to pay for all the labor, all the diesel. I mean, this is hundreds, if not, hundreds of acres. So they can justify it, and I think there are certain instances in any high value crop where you can justify it, but it's excessive. What's interesting to me is I've always had this sort of internal bias that I'm all about the soil, and so I do foliars. I always have, but I'm sort of a constant skeptic about how much is making it into the plant. So that was sort of validating to hear. Okay, the fourth thing, and this is what I think is most interesting and most missed in the cannabis conversation, is the number of new shoots and the rate of shoot growth is massively important for the use of calcium. So any growing shoot requires a tremendous amount of calcium. And so in apple production, they are preventing terminal growth and they're actually summer pruning, usually in like May, to prevent too many growing shoots. Because when you have too many growing shoots, it's an enormous calcium requirement for the plant. And I saw that in my orchard, there was a pest that essentially ate the top of every um, shoot. I sprayed
Oh
just a couple
no.
days too late, and so what happened is it essentially topped my plant. Imagine topping a cannabis plant. Well, it did that to every shoot on my tree, which then turned into 4 new shoots. So I
Mhm.
quadrupled the number of new growing shoots on my trees, and that I'm fairly confident created a calcium deficiency. So this is a very long-winded way to summarize what I've been thinking about with calcium, but I think cannabis growers need to think about of um, the number of shoots that are actively growing and the rate at which they're growing, because there's a piece of calcium I have never been able to figure out, which is oftentimes I'll see sufficient calcium on a paste test, let's just say 150 to 200 parts per million. I'll see 80% base saturation, which I don't put much weight on, but I know a lot of growers do. So by those two metrics, calcium is sufficient in the soil. The grower is doing calcium foliars and their VPD is good and their soil moisture is relatively good. Maybe they're even using blue mats and measuring it. And so, but then I get tissue test results back and the calcium is still at, let's say, 3.5 or 4%. And the other thing I'll add is there's not an excess of magnesium or potassium to antagonize calcium uptake.
Okay.
And the only other thing in that grand picture of calcium is the number of growing shoots and the rate of growth. So I'm just going to stop there and throw that out there for listeners to kind of chew on over the next several months or the next growing cycle.
I have so many thoughts and questions. Yeah. So, I mean, that would be one reason it'd be more advantageous to grow more plants to create a canopy versus a single plant, just for the ability of the plant to move calcium effectively to all the shoots that are creating the canopy. Um, but getting back to the calcium example, when I think of calcium, um, one of the things I think about is evapotranspiration, because calcium moves through the xylem, and I always confuse the two, but I think I got it right this time. Because
Yep.
it moves through the xylem, it's very linked to transpiration rate, which then moves me over to thinking about environment and VPD. So when I think about calcium movement in the plant or out to the leaf surface, that's where my brain goes first, is moisture levels in the soil and environment around the plant. Now, I don't know how you would manipulate that in an apple orchard, but I wonder about, like, is that, I mean, should that be the first way we approach calcium? Because when I listen to this podcast, I'm wondering if people are going to think, oh, this, I just need to be spraying calcium like crazy onto my plant. And it sounds to me like the way you're describing it, that is the last 10%. Like there's all these other things that need to be in place first.
Yeah, I want to reiterate that I think that foliars are at best 10%. I don't have any hard evidence for this. This is just my intuition. But no, I think foliars are the last thing to think about. Um,
Okay.
I think I think what you're saying is more accurate, because another anecdote is the tomato growers who experience blossom end rot, another calcium disorder. It's often inconsistent soil moisture where the drybacks are too big and calcium uptake stops. So I agree with you, but I think once you cover soil moisture and VPD, there's very few other toggles that we have to increase transpiration. I mean, airflow, I suppose, like, but I think that's similar to,
Yeah,
um,
airflow over the leaf surface, I think, would be a big
right,
thing to look at
right.
there.
But so airflow over the leaf surface, VPD, and soil moisture. I don't know what else we can manipulate.
I think that's it. But I wonder if you're spraying calcium every 48 hours, are you creating pathogen pressure or is the
Well, so in indoor cannabis production, that's not something I would recommend. That's just an anecdote from the Apple industry. Um,
yeah, yeah. I mean, for the Apple industry, though, I would think you just be opening yourself up to a variety of different
well, so the beauty of
fungal
Eastern
pathogens.
Washington, as you know, those Cascade Mountains are wild. You're probably it's probably raining outside right now for you. Um,
Eastern Washington's different, though. It's a
it's
very
bone
dry
dry.
climate.
It's
Yeah,
bone dry. So when you
yeah.
foliar, it that I one of the primary reasons there's all the apples are produced over there is the dry climate reduces disease pressure. It's way
Okay.
easier to be an organic grower in Eastern Washington than it is to grow apples in Michigan or New York or really anywhere else. It's part of the reason I like Western Colorado. The air is just bone dry.
So there's probably lower spore pressure
Way
anyway.
lower. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
VPD is not balanced necessarily in these dry, I mean, in these outdoor dry environments. It's too dry. The humidity is just too low um, for optimal VPD. But what that means is very low disease pressure. So there's a trade-off there.
Yeah. So you talk about all these. You talked about cell division. Let's start there, actually. So you said when the plant's at levels where it's doing its highest cell division, we can target drybacks and things like that. Do we really know in cannabis when those moments are that we should be triggering drybacks or considering them?
So the cell division is for the apple production. It's cell division of the fruit, which is, a 30-day period after pollination. And so that's when they're doing, so they've identified what they would call a critical point in the fruit life cycle where they do the foliars every 48 hours. It's not all season. It's like for 2 to 4 weeks after pollination. I do not think that there's a critical growth period that's been identified in cannabis production when calcium is needed the most. And in fact, it seems to me like it's needed throughout the entire growth cycle. So again, there's just a difference there. It's not an apple, it's a cannabis plant. So I generally believe that it's especially needed in veg. I think it's critically important to maximize calcium uptake in veg. It's hard to overdo it. In organic production, I've never seen it overdone. Um, and so I think the reason that it's so important in veg is not because it's a critical point of influence. It's just because you can't get it back. Once you're at week 4 of flower, you're not gonna catch up if your calcium uptake wasn't high enough. And what I've sort of seen through years of working with cannabis growers is the highest yielding plants have to have enough calcium going into flower. And I also believe that the lowest disease pressure and just the best vigor and general plant health comes from sufficient calcium levels. So the reason I like focusing on veg is because you don't want to play catch up with calcium. Like you mentioned, its movement is in the transpiration stream, the water going up through the xylem, and so um, you just want to maintain that stream of calcium throughout the entire cycle, the entire life of the plant.
So let's talk about this from sort of I guess a more like applied uh, real world usage example. So
Great.
you've talked about gypsum, and I'm gonna say things here that a lot of growers already know, but I just want to make sure we're not missing anything. Gypsum, calcium sulfate. It's not really going to impact the pH. Um, you really can't overdo sulfur from what I've seen. So it's a really great form of calcium. And there's a lot of different ways to get gypsum. You do want to watch heavy metals because they will vary across gypsum sources.
Yes.
And the smaller the particulate, the more soluble it is, the more available it's going to be to the plant because it has a larger surface area. And that goes for all amendments. Anything else really quickly you want about calcium before we talk a little bit about some of these other limes and other options?
Um, well, I was going to say Wollastonite, but we'll talk about that. The only other thing I'd say
Yeah.
just in the particle size conversation is I think it's a really good technique to diversify the particle size of the gypsum. So,
Hmm.
which So yeah, let's just say you're doing a pre-plant amendment. Usually I'd recommend a powdered gypsum, often a solution grade gypsum, partially because you can also feed that or top dress it in the middle of the cycle. So it's just nice to have one gypsum product on hand and use it as a pre-plant amendment and also in the middle of the round. But there is a technique to use a granular gypsum, which might, just release a little bit slower. Technically, it's not a slow releasing fertilizer. And in theory, if you dropped a granular gypsum in water, it should dissolve into its constituent particles that are just the same size as the solution grade. But in practice, it does take a little bit more time. So it acts sort of as a slow release fertilizer. That's one technique, especially if you're running a lot of water through your soil. Like if you are watering to runoff, which I'd say most living soil growers aren't, but if that's the case, you are going to be flushing some of that solution grade gypsum out of your system constantly. So having granular gypsum might help. And the only other thing I'd mention is sulfur from gypsum, I don't think can be excessive. But sulfur from, let's say, a more soluble product like potassium sulfate, I do think can be excessive. Like if I dissolve potassium sulfate in water and do a paste test on it, I'll see like 420 parts per million of sulfur, which I think is too high. But from gypsum specifically, I don't think excess sulfur is an issue.
That brought up a good point. So when we're talking about runoff, I do think when with a lot of even living soil growers, when we're in containers at the smaller stages of growth, it's impossible not to have runoff. So we are leaching at some
Yes.
point. So that's where I think maybe in veg having some granular gypsum in there might be a useful way to just make sure that it's breaking down a little bit slower than the powdered gypsum. I think that's an interesting point that you brought
Yeah,
up.
it's just less mobile in those little pellets.
In regards to sulfur, though, so I've always thought of sulfur, I mean, critical for terpene development, a lot of different plant processes, but not really something that I've seen at like a sulfur toxicity in cannabis per se, but really the risk is just osmotic shock, osmotic pressure in the soil due to salt stress. So all of these things that we're talking about are quote unquote salts, and the more of them that are in the soil, the higher the salt level of the soil is. Is there other things that, like you mentioned, the issue of it with like potassium sulfate? What is it about the sulfur and potassium sulfate versus gypsum that you see, causing more issues?
So the only difference is if you drop potassium sulfate in the soil solution, if you apply it to the soil and you water it, it'll dissolve up to over 400 grams per gallon of water compared to gypsum, which is only like 8 or 9 grams per gallon of water. So the solubility of that potassium sulfate molecule is just so much higher than the calcium sulfate molecule that it will release more ions into the solution. The sulfur is the same. I mean, it's the same thing, but you just get such a higher concentration of it that the EC, the soluble salts, the osmotic stress, those are all somewhat synonymous. That's just way higher with a fertilizer that's more soluble.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, but in
Okay.
general, if we're just focusing on gypsum, no, I don't think. I mean, your soil solution will go to maybe 100 or 120 ppm of soluble sulfur, and that's almost never an issue. You will see the sulfur on a tissue test be toward the high end of the sufficiency range or even out of the sufficiency range, but I don't think there's any issue with that. There's no antagonisms with other anions. I guess we're getting into more of the realm of anecdotes here, but some growers, well, there's two things that I've heard from growers. One of them is a myth, in my opinion, and that's that sulfur levels like that are kill soil biology. And I just don't think there's any evidence of that. I mean, soil microbes need sulfur, um, and there are certain populations or certain species that actually prefer high sulfur environments. You'll see a shift in the population profile, like you will with any management action that you take. But it definitely doesn't kill microbes. I think that comes from the idea that there are a lot of fungicides in organic production that contain sulfur. So there's something called the Bordeaux mixture or lime sulfur. Like it's a great fungicide when topically applied to the leaves, but it's in a totally different it's completely different chemistry in those products versus sulfur in the soil. And at 100 ppm, it's not toxic, it's not caustic, it's not. I don't understand the functional mechanism in which it would kill microbes, and you still see microbial action. I don't have a microscope. I don't use a microscope, but the microbes are clearly thriving based on a number of other metrics when you use a lot of gypsum. So I do not believe that. The other thing is smoke quality. People have told me that, there's this ash color debate. I think Brandon, when you had Brandon on, I think he addressed this very well. But I did go down this rabbit hole for a while, like, is sulfur affecting ash color? And my conclusion is I'm not 100% confident with the ash color debate, but I'm pretty confident that it doesn't. So I wouldn't call that a myth, because I still think I'm still unclear on the contribution of minerals to ash color, but I can very confidently say that the primary determinant of ash color is incomplete combustion of carbon-based molecules, of organic compounds, and this is what Brandon addressed really well. So that's the number one thing, and I think it's very likely that that's the only thing. But growers have come to me a lot and say, "Look at my sulfur. This is going to affect my ash color," and I don't think that's accurate.
I have nothing to add to that. Yeah. So, okay, I feel like we covered gypsum. Obviously, there's other forms of calcium that we can get into the plant or into the soil or foliar. Do you want to talk a little bit about lime, dolomite, and then wollastonite? I think are the big three.
Let me just pitch. I don't want to talk about lime or dolomite, but I want to pitch wollastonite
Okay.
as for two reasons. One is it's the least expensive source of silica. And I think most cannabis growers understand that silica can be highly beneficial for a number of reasons. And there aren't a lot of organic options. And the options tend to be expensive, except wollastonite. Wollastonite is very inexpensive. And it's a great way, if your pH is just a little bit low, to increase the pH and provide a bunch of really inexpensive silica to your soil. Plant available. It also has a slower, I think, what's called a dissolution rate than lime. So if you have downward pressure on your soil pH from your water or from peat mineralizing or from organic acids or whatever, once that acidity eats through lime, if lime is the only pH buffering molecule in the soil, you can get a very sharp decline, a very sharp and fast, rapid rate of pH drop in your soil. Things like oyster shell and wollastonite have a bit more buffering capacity. It's a bit slower, so you're not going to see as aggressive of a pH drop. So, I mean, if you're checking your pH, if you're soil testing, it doesn't really matter. You can just keep adding lime. But I like wollastonite because it in theory is that drop isn't going to happen as fast once the acidity neutralizes all those alkaline molecules.
That answers a puzzle for me, because I've seen soil tests where they test, beginning of cycle, mid cycle, and the pH, being logarithmic, I wouldn't have expected it to drop as quickly as it did, given
it can drop like a rock.
Yeah, what they've told me, and that's always puzzled me on it. I've seen it a few times now. So you're saying that's all due to the microbes or the plant utilizing the alkalinity of the lime. And then there's just
so once it chews through all that lime, it's sort of like if you dump vinegar on lime, it fizzes and bubbles and does the little volcano thing. Well, eventually, if you keep pouring vinegar on it, it eats through all that lime and it stops bubbling. Like the lime doesn't, it neutralizes all of it, and there's nothing left to buffer the soil. Now, compost helps and other things help because they also have buffering capacity. So I wouldn't expect to see that pH drop in your soil, for example, because there's just a lot of organic compounds in there. But eventually, it could happen. It'd be more. I would expect it more in like closer to just a non-compost based media, like a cocoa peat perlite mix
Pro
with
mix sort of
dolomite
thing.
or whatever. Yeah, like a pro mix
Yeah.
for sure. In a pro mix, I think you can see a sharp drop. So there is more. I do agree. There's more buffering capacity in living soils, but I disagree that you don't have to worry about pH in living soils. I think
Oh,
you
let's talk
definitely need
about
to
it.
keep an
Let's
eye on
dive
it.
into that because I love this topic. I think that's so critical. So yeah, and I know we've talked about this, and I want to hear your spiel because my big thing is yes, living soil has buffering capacity. Microbes are amazing. People, and that's what people rely on. But if we can get pH into an optimal range, so the plant isn't wasting photosynthetic energy that's creating on just getting the nutrients it wants out of the soil, like why wouldn't we adjust the pH? Like I've never
Well, okay. So
understood that argument.
for people who say pH doesn't matter in a living soil, okay, I dare you to run your soil at 5.0 in a living soil and see what happens. I mean, it's not good. Plant health plant health declines quickly at really low pHs. I've seen it so many times. Um, now,
Here's the argument you hear really though, Bryant. And this is and I know you'll be able to speak to this. It's like I've never pH'd my soil. My
right,
water
right.
is 8.5 or my water is 8 or I use rainwater,
Well, yeah,
whatever.
yeah. My second
Why
point to what I was saying is going to say to the we'll run your soil at 5.0. Well, that's kind of hard to create a 5.0 pH soil in a living soil because we put so much into these soils, and most of these things we put in, specifically compost, but also all the organic amendments, soft rock phosphate, crustacean meal, lime, wollastonite, all of those things are putting upward pressure on the pH. So usually after you mix a soil blend, it's going to land, in a higher pH range. Not always, but often. So then a grower runs their soil, they have great success, and they say, "I've never pH'd my soil." Well, it started with a good pH. It started with a high pH, and you continue adding amendments and compost that put upward pressure on the pH, and or water in your example. So maybe you have a high pH water that's putting constant upward pressure on your media pH, and so you don't have to worry about it. But that's not. I think the mistake people make is creating a universal statement like you don't have to worry about pH because it's a living soil. That is inaccurate technically. That's just not a. It'd be more accurate to say a lot of living soils or a lot of peat-based medias you don't have to worry about pH. But to say because it's a living soil or all living soils you don't have to worry about it is not true. And I've seen so many soil tests and I've seen so many issues and I'm just 100% confident with that.
Yeah, so the point I was getting at is like probably more like I don't have to pH my water because I have a living soil and my water is
Ah,
an 8.
ah,
But I think you know why that might be okay. Um, do you want to just touch on that? I mean, we're getting off
yes,
topic, but
yes.
I
No, no, no,
think
this is
I
great.
think it's interesting.
And sorry, I interrupted you. I just was eager
No,
to
no, please
keep
jump
talking.
in.
Um, So when it comes to pHing water, same thing to say you don't have to pH water with a living soil is not. Sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not. So what's confusing about water is you can have a water with a pH of let's say 7.5 that doesn't need to be pHed. You can have a water with a pH of a different water with a pH of 7.5 that I would argue should be pHed. And so why that's confusing is because um, I always stumble on explaining this. There are it depends on the total molecules in that water that measured best by a term called alkalinity, which is not pH. It's how much acid would it require to lower the pH of that water.
Mhm.
And so in water number one, it may have an alkalinity of 50 ppm, and it just takes a tiny little drop of citric acid, and the pH drops like a rock. The same water with a pH, water number two, with the same pH of 7.5, it might take a lot of acid to drop the pH because the there's just way more hydroxides or bicarbonate in water number two. So water, number one, the soil will buffer that pH. The water is going to reflect the soil pH very quickly because there's just not a lot of alkaline molecules in that water. Water, number two, requires so much acid to neutralize those alkaline molecules that when it hits the water, the soil solution is going to reflect the water pH. The soil is not going to buffer that very well. So that's what's confusing is people take the pH of their water and they think they either need to pH it or they don't need to pH it, but you actually don't know just based on the pH. You have to get a water test and look at the alkalinity. And I usually think when the alkalinity is over 120 ppm, that's a good time to consider pHing your water if you're trying to optimize, if you're trying to grow a perfectly healthy crop. You don't need to, but if you want to optimize, I think you should. Once it gets up to, let's say, 180, I think it's critical. I think over time, if you're running your soil over and over again, you're living soil over, let's say, 10 rounds, you're going to see issues.
Yeah, you said it perfectly. And I think that's the thing that we see in forums is where people are like, oh, throw away your pH pen. I don't need it anymore because I switched to living soil. I just want people to pump the brakes a little bit and say, okay, I may not need it quite as much because yes, the microbes in the soil will help buffer the pH. All the organic amendments that we're adding to compost, all of this creates a very complex solution that's better at buffering. But there are circumstances, and you see them, I see them, because we see soil tests from all over the country, even internationally sometimes, and things don't, not everyone has access to clean water.
Exactly. Yeah, if you, I would love to send that grower a 275-gallon tote of well water from Arizona with 100 parts per million of sodium and 350 ppm of alkalinity and a pH of 8.4. That's a different situation, and obviously that's an extreme example. But
see, when I think of
universals are
bad water,
dangerous.
yeah, I go to Oklahoma in my brain, but
Yeah, Oklahoma,
Arizona would be right there on the list.
anywhere arid. When you
Yeah,
drill a well in an arid environment, you're going to get something weird.
yeah.
Now, the reverse can be true with usually in a wet environment. Sometimes you can have super acidic water, much more rare in my opinion, but you could have acidic water. The solution to that's way easier. You can just line your soil or maybe wollastonite or oyster shell. You can push the soil pH a little higher than you would normally. And then that acidic water combines with the high pH soil and it creates a nice soil solution pH. So you don't necessarily, I mean, or you could pH up your water, but that term pH up usually implies that you're going to add a liquid bottled potassium carbonate, potassium hydroxide, sometimes not organic, and then you're just putting potassium in your system to increase the pH. It's far better in my opinion because I'm way more interested in pushing calcium is to just add a alkaline calcium soil amendment and buffer the pH through the soil and not pH up your water with some liquid bottle.
So you talk about wollastonite and oyster shell together. They're obviously quite different. Oyster shell being primarily calcium carbonate and in wollastonite being calcium silicate. One thing I want to point out is calcium silicate doesn't move the pH needle as quickly as
No.
lime will. So
And it's not as effective per unit of amendment either. Like lime will increase the pH more. Every cup of lime will increase it more than a cup of wollastonite. Sorry, I interrupted again. Keep going.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, so it doesn't move the needles quickly. So if you need to raise your pH quickly between cycles, then you want to consider lime or oyster shell. Though I've always considered oyster shell and lime in my head the same thing because they're both 99% calcium carbonate or whatever.
Yeah.
With the oyster shell maybe having a little more impurities, and then I've just looked at it in regards to particle size. So it's interesting to me that you're differentiating oyster shell from lime.
No, I think you're right. I think when you say that, I actually think you're right, and I agree. I think it's just that oyster shell is more coarse. So maybe that's not the right way to frame it. I think that the rate is still slower for sure, but it's probably due to particle size, like you said, the coarseness of the material. Um, Although it's an interesting point, I'd have to think about that more. But I think you're right. And same with aragonite. People always mention aragonite to me, and I looked it up, and it's just calcium carbonate. So I do agree that those three products should probably just be clustered in the same category because they're all calcium carbonate. When wollastonite is a completely different molecule. So
Okay. Yeah, one thing, speaking of calcium, that I thought was interesting is relating to eggshells and the
oh yeah.
use of crushed eggshells. I wasn't aware of how unavailable that calcium was due to something that the chicken coats it with that makes it less, it just doesn't break down very quickly, even when you crush it more. Have you read anything about that?
I haven't read anything about it, but I have some experience with some. It's a very common Jadam input, and in Jadam, you take apple cider vinegar, 10 parts apple cider vinegar, 1 part eggshell. As you crush the eggshells up, you leave them in the jar of apple cider vinegar for months and months and months. And I've seen tests on that. I've gotten really into testing all these different KNF and Jadam inputs, and unfortunately, it's called WCA. The calcium levels that I've seen were super low, but I'm still struggling with this WCA test to know the dilution of the WCA to water. But even at the recommended dilution rate, which is I think a teaspoon per gallon of water, the ppms were too low, in my opinion, way too low. So even after sitting in apple cider vinegar for months and months and months, very little calcium was liberated from those eggshells, or there just weren't enough eggshells. And I'm not a huge, I mean, right next to the WCA recipe in the Jadam book is quick lime, or no, sorry, quick oyster shell WCA. I'm way more interested in that. And the results I've seen is that the parts per million of calcium are far higher from vinegar and oyster shell flour than it is from eggshells. So no, I don't promote, or really, I'm not really drawn to using eggshells at all. A, because it seems totally insoluble, and B, because it just doesn't seem like they contribute that much calcium compared to these other things we're talking about.
Yeah, they've done some decomposition studies on it, and they just found it doesn't break down as quickly as you would think. It's not a period of weeks to months. It's like a period of years in a lot of cases in terms of that calcium being liberated. I have to go back and read more, but I thought that was interesting.
Well, and especially, I mean, that's in apple cider vinegar. Imagine in a compost or a soil where the pH is 7.
Oh,
It's not
that's
going
where
to be.
they tested it in soil. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it'll take
What I'm
decades.
talking
It'll
about.
take
Yeah.
yeah, it's like yeah, it'll take decades. I mean, the solubility of oyster shell and soft rock phosphate and a lot of these products that need microbial decomposition and weathering, which is non-microbial sometimes. The difference there is wild when it comes to pH. pH is a way bigger driver of decomposition of those types of things than microbial activity oftentimes. So I don't recommend soft rock phosphate when the soil pH is high because it'll take so long to actually release compared to when the pH is 5.5. It's a wild difference in the rate.
I want to point out that oyster shell flour is typically a mined product too. People in their brains think, oh, I want to get oyster shell flour because it's more sustainable or it's more organic than lime. But really, they're both mined products. One's just being mined from old marine deposits, and the other's being mined from, a lime deposit. So,
I didn't know that.
yeah. So sometimes I think the way we think about trying to be more sustainable or more organic or avoid things for whatever ethical reasons, it's a little more complicated than we realize.
Always.
So, anything else on calcium before we move on to another topic?
No, nothing on my end.
That was Bryant Mason, and you are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast. Don't forget to check out the podcast page at www.kisorganics.com. Just click on the Learn tab, then Podcast. And just a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon channel with a free 7-day trial and tiers as low as $5 a month. We do book club, special cultivation tips and tricks, monthly video hangouts, and more to connect and share your grow, and even give out seed packs and other gifts at certain tier levels. Your support at Patreon or sourcing your products through Kiss Organics is what supports the podcast, and I really appreciate it. Thanks for listening.